The deed arrived in Clara Vaughn's hand, still smelling of her dead husband's tobacco, folded into thirds and pressed so many times along its creases that the paper had grown soft as cloth at the seams, and she would carry it across 300 miles of hard country before a single man in uniform would bother to read past the first line. She had not set out from Abilene in grief, exactly. Grief was a thing she had already spent, worn down to its last threads during the long months of watching Thomas Vaughn cough himself into a shallow grave on the edge of the property. He had loved more than he had ever quite managed to love her. She had grieved him honestly, had wept real tears over his pine box, had stayed long enough in that Kansas town to see him buried properly, and to receive the condolences of neighbors who had known him longer than she had. But when the banker in Abilene, a thick-necked man named Horace Pell who wore his prosperity in the buttons of his vest, had looked across his wide desk and told her with the blankness of a man reading a weather report that the land Thomas had claimed out west, the parcel he had registered and deeded and dreamed over for 6 years, was not recognized by the territorial bank, by the local land office, or by Fort Reader, which sat square in the middle of the disputed region and effectively controlled everything within 40 miles, Clara had stopped grieving and started moving. She was 27 years old. She had brown hair that burned red in direct sun and green eyes the color of creek water after a rain, and she was small in the way that deceived people into thinking she was fragile until they watched her work. She had been teaching school in Abilene when she married Thomas. She had kept his accounts after the marriage. She knew how to read a legal document, which was more than most men in the territory could say honestly about themselves, and when Horace Pell told her the deed was no good, she had taken it back from his fat fingers, smoothed it carefully, folded it along its worn creases, and tucked it back into the leather satchel she carried against her side. "I'll take it to the fort myself," she said. Horace Pell had actually laughed, not unkindly, which was almost worse. "Mrs. Vaughn, the commanding officer at Fort Reader, is Colonel Harlan Bick. He has turned back land claims from men with lawyers. He is not going to give you the time of day." "Then I'll take whatever time he gives me," she said, "and I'll make it enough." The journey west was not romantic. It was a hired wagon with a driver named Stu Colfax who smelled of onions and said almost nothing for the first 4 days, which suited Clara fine. The land opened up around them as Kansas gave way to the edge of the territories, the sky growing enormous in the way it did out here, everything flattening and stretching until you felt very small and very clear, like a word written alone on a blank page. The grass was tall in the low places and scorched brown on the rises, and the wind came in long rolling pushes that made the wagon canvas snap. Clara sat with her satchel in her lap and watched the country and thought about Thomas, not in grief but in inventory. He had been a decent man, optimistic beyond what the evidence warranted, which had been both his charm and his undoing. He had filed the claim on that parcel 6 years ago when the land office in Dodge City was still operating under territorial law, and the deed had been properly witnessed and signed and stamped. She had read it herself a dozen times. She had read the relevant sections of the Homestead Act. She had read the subsequent territorial amendments. The deed was good. She was certain of it. She just needed someone with the authority and the patience to see what she saw. They reached Fort Reader on a Thursday in September of 1873, the air already carrying that first cold edge that came early to the high plains, the sky pale blue and enormous overhead. The fort was larger than she had expected, a proper military installation with log walls and a gate manned by 2 soldiers who looked at the wagon with the flat professional boredom of men who had seen everything come through and been surprised by none of it. Stu Colfax pulled up and gave the soldiers a nod. "Woman here to see the commanding officer," he said. One of the soldiers, barely 20, with a face still holding the last of its boyishness, looked at Clara. "Ma'am, the colonel doesn't hold open hours. You need to submit a written request to the adjutant's office." "I have a deed that needs to be honored," Clara said clearly. "Who is the adjutant?" "Lieutenant Monroe handles those matters. But ma'am, if it's a land claim, is Lieutenant Monroe inside?" The soldier glanced at his partner, who shrugged with the profound indifference of a man who had learned not to care. "He is," the young one said. "Then I'd like to speak with him, please," Clara said, and there was something in her voice, not harshness, not desperation, just a flat certainty that she was going to be heard, that made the soldier step aside and wave the wagon through. Lieutenant Monroe turned out to be a narrow man in his early 40s with thinning hair and ink on his fingers, who occupied a small office near the main building. He received her politely enough, offered her a seat, looked at the deed she placed on his desk, read the first 2 lines, and handed it back to her. "This deed is registered under the old territorial land office system," he said, without a trace of apology. "Fort Reader doesn't recognize claims made under that authority. The region came under military jurisdiction in 1870, and all prior claims were required to be re-registered within 18 months. This parcel has not been re-registered. My husband was ill during that period," Clara said. "He did not know about the re-registration requirement. The notice was not widely circulated." "That may be," Monroe said, "but the deadline passed." "The land reverts to territorial holdings administered by the fort." Clara sat very still. "Is there anyone else I can speak to?" Monroe looked at her with something that might have been sympathy but was too practiced to be genuine. "You could submit a formal written appeal to Colonel Bick, but I'll tell you honestly, ma'am, he has denied every one of those appeals. The rule is the rule." "Then I'd like to submit the appeal," she said. Monroe blinked. He had clearly expected her to leave. "I'll have a form prepared for you," he said, with the slight adjustment of a man recalibrating. She stayed in the fort's small civilian boarding quarters that night, a single room with a narrow bed and a window that looked out onto the parade ground. She wrote the appeal herself by lamplight, carefully, citing the specific sections of the homestead legislation and the territorial amendments and the date of the original filing. She was thorough. She had always been thorough. Thomas used to say she thought like a lawyer trapped in a schoolteacher's life, and she had taken it as the compliment she chose it to be. The next morning she submitted the appeal to Monroe's office. Monroe told her the colonel would review it within the week, and that she was welcome to wait if she chose. She chose. The fort had a rhythm to it that was not entirely unpleasant to observe. Soldiers drilled on the parade ground in the mornings and tended to horses and equipment in the afternoons. Officers came and went on business she was not privy to. There were a handful of other civilians on the grounds. A sutler who ran a small trade goods store, a laundress named Me who had a laugh like a horse and an opinion on everything, and a scout named Del Pickett who was 50 years old and missing 2 fingers on his left hand, and who seemed to be on speaking terms with everyone at the fort regardless of rank. It was Del Pickett who mentioned Captain Aaron Garrett to her on her second day, while they were both waiting for the sutler to locate a specific kind of thread that Me had apparently sent Del to find on her behalf. "You're the widow with the deed," Del said. "It was not unkind. It was simply the way information traveled in a place this small." "I am," Clara said. "Monroe turned you down." "He did. I've filed an appeal with the colonel." Del made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh. "Bick doesn't do much appealing in the other direction, if you take my meaning." "So I've been told," Clara said. "Is there anyone here who might actually look at it properly?" Del scratched at the back of his neck and looked at the ceiling of the sutler's store with the expression of a man running through a list. "There's Captain Garrett," he said finally. "He's the post's legal officer. Handles disputes, property matters, that sort of thing. Just got back from a posting in Fort Leavenworth. He reads things carefully. That's the best I can say." "Where do I find him?" Clara asked. "He'll be in the officers' mess at noon," Del said. "Tall fellow. Brown hair going a little long for regulations. He'll have a book with him." Clara filed that information away and thanked Del, and bought the thread herself since the sutler seemed genuinely unable to locate it, which earned her a startled look from Del, and a delighted one from Me when she delivered it later. At noon, she positioned herself near the entrance to the officers' mess and waited. She was not a woman who had patience for most kinds of waiting, but she had patience for this kind, the purposeful kind, the kind where you were not waiting passively but holding still until the moment you needed to move. He came out of the mess a few minutes after noon, and Dell's description had been accurate as far as it went but had undersold the details considerably. Aaron Garrett was tall, yes, and his brown hair was slightly past regulation length, curling a little at the collar of his uniform. He was perhaps 30 or 31, with the kind of face that was more interesting than strictly handsome, a strong jaw, with a few days of stubble that he clearly had not gotten around to shaving, dark eyes that moved with a quick intelligence, a small scar on his chin that might have come from a razor or a fight or a childhood fall. He was carrying a book, as Dell had promised, a worn volume he was tucking under his arm as he pushed through the door, and he nearly walked directly into Clara, who stepped forward at precisely that moment. He stopped. His eyes adjusted from the distance he had been looking at to the nearness of her, and there was a brief recalibration in his expression before he settled into polite attention. "Excuse me, ma'am, I wasn't watching where I was going." "I was watching where you were going," Clara said, and extended her hand before the words could embarrass her. "Clara Vaughn, I need about 10 minutes of your time, Captain, if you can spare them." He looked at her hand and then shook it, with the slight surprise of a man who had expected something more tentative. "Aaron Garrett," he said, "what can I do for you, Mrs. Vaughn? I have a deed to 420 acres in the lower Crestwood Valley. It was filed properly under the Territorial Land Office in 1867. I have been told by Lieutenant Monroe and by most of the financial establishment in Abilene that it is not worth the paper it is printed on. I believe they are wrong, and I would like to show you why." Aaron Garrett looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite read. It was attentive and careful, and there was something else in it, something that had not yet named itself. "You've spoken to Monroe already." "Yesterday, and you're still here. I am not in the habit of leaving when the first person tells me no," she said. Something happened at the corner of his mouth that was almost a smile. "Come to my office," he said. His office was a modest room in the northeast corner of the main building, with a real desk and real bookshelves and maps pinned to the wooden walls with the careful precision of a man who needed to know exactly where everything was. He cleared a chair for her and sat behind the desk and held out his hand for the deed. She placed it on the desk rather than handing it to him, smoothed open, so he could read it properly from the beginning. He read it. That was the first thing that separated him from everyone else. He actually read it. Not the first line, not a skim, but a full reading, his eyes moving slowly and deliberately down the page, his mouth still, his expression concentrated. He turned to the second page. He went back to the first page and read a particular section again. He looked up. "When was this filed?" he asked. "March 1867, Clara said. "The Land Office was operating under the Territorial Settlement Act of 1865. The deed was witnessed by 2 Dodge City officials and stamped by the land registrar. I have the original stamp impression right there in the lower left corner." He looked at it. "I see it." He read again. "The re-registration notice, Monroe told you it was circulated." "Monroe told me there was a deadline. I told him the notice was not widely distributed. He did not dispute that, just said the deadline had passed regardless." Aaron set the deed down and leaned back in his chair, and Clara watched him think. It was a specific kind of thinking, visible but contained, like water running deep and clear under ice. "There was a provision," he said slowly, almost to himself, "in the 1871 amendment to the Territorial Settlement Act. A hardship clause. It was written in to account for exactly this kind of situation claimants, who were unable to respond to the re-registration requirement due to circumstances beyond their control. Illness, absence, or inability to access the notice through no fault of their own." He reached to his bookshelf without looking away from the deed and pulled a volume that was flagged with several strips of paper. He opened it to one of the flags and read for a moment. "Yes, Section 14, Paragraph 3. If the original deed was properly filed under the 1865 Act and the claimant can demonstrate reasonable cause for failure to re-register within the allotted period, the fort's legal officer has the authority to grant an extension of recognition. Clara went very still. And you are the fort's legal officer? He looked up from the book and met her eyes. I am. The silence lasted only a second, but it was full of something that had not been there before, like the air before a storm changes without the storm yet being visible. Then Clara said, steadily, "What do I need to demonstrate?" "Documentation of the illness," he said. "Medical records or witness testimony establishing that your husband was incapacitated during the 18-month re-registration window, which ran from January 1870 to July 1871. "I have his doctor's letters from that period," Clara said. "They are in my satchel." Aaron looked at her. There was that almost smile again. "You came prepared." "I came prepared for the argument Monroe made," she said. "I did not know about the hardship clause." "Most people don't," he said. "I only know about it because I spent 3 months in Fort Leavenworth reading through every amendment to every Territorial Land Act passed in the last 15 years. It was either that or learn to play cards, and I am not a very good card player." Clara found herself smiling at that genuinely, the kind of smile she had not given anyone in quite a long time. "Then I am very glad you find cards unsuitable." He stood and came around the desk, and she noticed for the first time that he moved with a slight economy, nothing wasted, nothing performative, just the movement of a man who knew exactly where he was in space. "Let me see the medical letters," he said. "If they cover the right period, I think we can make a strong case to present to the colonel." "And if the colonel refuses?" she asked, standing also, reaching into her satchel. "Then we go over his head," Aaron said simply, and she looked at him with a sharp attention that he met without flinching. She handed him the letters. He read them at the desk while she stood by the window looking out at the parade ground, where a group of soldiers was being drilled by a sergeant with a voice that carried through the glass. The land outside the fort's walls was visible in the distance, the flat, brown-gold reach of the plains, and somewhere out there, 3 days' ride to the southwest, was the parcel that Thomas had loved and that she intended to keep. Not for grief, not even entirely for Thomas, but because it was right and because no one got to simply take what was right away from a person just because they had waited until that person was alone. "These are good," Aaron said behind her. Dr. Ira Holcomb of Abilene, dates covering April 1870 through November 1871. That covers the entire re-registration window. He paused. "I'm sorry about your husband, Mrs. Vaughn." She turned. The sympathy in his voice was different from Horace Pell's practiced condolences and Monroe's polite acknowledgement. It was quieter and more real, the kind that came from someone who had been in the vicinity of loss himself, she thought. "Thank you," she said. "He was a good man. He wanted that land badly." "And you?" Aaron asked. "What do you want with it?" It was a direct question, maybe too direct for a first conversation, but Clara did not mind directness. She had lived surrounded by indirectness for years and found it exhausting. "I want what was his to be honored," she said. "After that, I'll decide what to do with it." He nodded slowly, studying her with that careful, dark attention. "I'll draft the formal petition tonight," he said. "Can you come back in the morning?" "I'm not going anywhere," she said. She walked back to her boarding room in the slanted late afternoon light, and she felt for the first time in a very long time that something might actually go the way it should. The morning brought a cold wind from the north and a sky streaked with high pale clouds. Clara arrived at Aaron's office at 8 o'clock and found him already there, his desk covered with papers, his coat hanging on the hook by the door. He had shaved, she noticed. The stubble was gone, which made him look a little younger but somehow also more like himself, more settled into his own face. "Sit down," he said, not looking up from the paper he was writing. "I'll be done with this in 2 minutes." She sat. She looked at his bookshelves. He had territorial law texts and military regulations and tucked at the end of one shelf, almost like he was mildly embarrassed by them, two novels that she recognized, one by Dickens, and one that she had read herself, a collection of poems by a poet she admired. 2 minutes passed and he put down his pen and looked at the petition with a critical expression and then handed it across the desk to her. "Read it," he said. "Tell me if I have the facts right." She read it. It was 3 pages, precisely written, citing the specific statute and section numbers, laying out the timeline of Thomas's illness and the dates of the re-registration window, and making the legal argument for the hardship clause clearly and without excess. At the end, it asked that the deed be officially recognized by Fort Reader under the authority of the post-legal officer, with a recommendation that the colonel countersign as a formal matter of record. "It's right," she said. "It's very good." "Any corrections?" Thomas's middle name was spelled incorrectly, one letter. He reached for the paper immediately and corrected it without any fuss, which Clara found she appreciated. Some men would have argued, "I'll present this to the colonel this morning," he said. "I want to be there when he reads it so I can answer any questions directly." "I'd like to be there as well," Clara said. Aaron looked at her with a complicated expression. "Colonel Bick is not an easy man to sit across from, Mrs. Vaughn. He has a tendency to use volume in place of logic. He does not enjoy being told he has been applying a rule incorrectly." "I have dealt with difficult men before," Clara said. "I don't doubt that," Aaron said, and again there was that quality in his voice, not quite admiration, not yet, but something adjacent to it, something paying close attention. "All right, come with me." Colonel Harlan Bick was exactly as advertised. He was a large man, red in the face, with white sideburns that he wore with the authority of a man who felt his facial hair confirmed his rank. He occupied the commander's office like a man who had been placed in a large chair and grown to fill it. When Aaron presented the petition with Clara seated to his right, Bick looked at the document the way Monroe had, skimming, impatient, and then looked at Clara with undisguised irritation. "Captain, I have already had Lieutenant Monroe handle this matter," he said. "The deed is not recognized. End of matter." "With respect, sir," Aaron said, and his voice was level and precise in a way that was more forceful than any amount of volume would have been. "The matter was not fully handled, because the hardship clause in Section 14 of the 1871 amendment was not applied. The claimant has documentation establishing that her late husband was medically incapacitated during the entire re-registration period. The clause grants the post-legal officer direct authority to extend recognition. This petition outlines that case in full." Bick's color deepened. "Garrett, I don't need a lesson in sir," Aaron said, still quiet, still level. "If I may ask you to read the petition, all of it." The statutory citations are on pages 2 and 3. The silence in the room was taut as wire. Clara sat very still and breathed slowly and watched the colonel. She had learned from years of managing difficult personalities in a schoolroom that patience at the right moment was more powerful than argument. She did not speak. She let Aaron's quiet insistence do its work. Bick looked at her, then at Aaron, then at the document. He read it, not happily, not graciously. But he read it, all 3 pages, his thick finger moving under the lines with the slow deliberateness of a man who had perhaps not read statutory language in some time. When he was done, he set it down on his desk and looked at the far wall for a moment. "The medical letters," he said finally. "You have the originals." "Present, sir," Aaron said, and placed them on the desk. Bick read those too, or read at them, checking the dates. There was a long silence. "If I countersign this," Bick said slowly with the tone of a man navigating around something he did not like, "it sets a precedent." "It applies an existing provision, sir," Aaron said. "The precedent is already set by the 1871 Act. We would be acting in accordance with it." Another silence. Then Bick reached for his pen with the expression of a man who had lost an argument he had not expected to lose and was trying not to show it too plainly. He signed the petition. He countersigned Aaron's recognition notice. He handed them to Aaron without looking at Clara. "The deed is recognized," he said. "Get out of my office." Clara waited until they were in the hallway before she let herself exhale. Aaron was holding the signed documents and looking at them with the careful expression of a man confirming that, yes, they said what he thought they said. Then he looked at her, and his eyes were warm in a way that crinkled slightly at the corners, and she felt something move in her chest that she was not quite ready to name but that she recognized as real. "You have your deed," he said. "We have my deed," she said. "Captain, I don't know how to thank you adequately." "You don't need to thank me," he said. "The law was on your side. I just read far enough to find it." They stood in the hallway for a moment, and the fort sounds came in around them. Voices, hoofbeats on the packed earth outside, the distant clang of the smithy. She was aware of how close they were standing, closer than strict propriety required, and neither of them moved to change it. "What will you do now?" he asked. "I need to visit the land," she said. "I have never actually seen it. Thomas described it to me many times, but I have never been there." She paused. "I'm not certain I should go alone." "No," he agreed. "You should not go alone. The route through the lower valley goes through some unsettled territory. There have been disputes with a group of ranchers in the Crestwood area who have been using some of the unclaimed parcels as common grazing land. They may not receive the news of your deed's recognition kindly." Clara considered this. "Are you suggesting I need an escort?" "I'm suggesting," Aaron said, with a careful neutrality that she saw straight through, "that if you would consent to it, I could accompany you. I have 2 days of leave owed to me, and I know the route." She looked at him and he looked at her, and they were both perfectly aware of what was happening, and neither of them said it directly, because it was September 1873, and they were both the kind of people who moved carefully in important matters. "I would appreciate the company," she said. They left the next morning on horseback, Clara on a roan mare she had hired from the fort's livery and Aaron on his own horse, a steady dark bay gelding named Colt that he handled with easy familiarity. The morning was cold and bright, the sky a hard clear blue, and the land opened up around them as they rode south and west. Aaron knew the route well enough to need no map, pointing out landmarks: a dry creek bed that ran full in spring, a line of cottonwoods that marked the edge of a former military patrol route, a low rise of red rock that could be seen for 20 miles in clear weather. He was quiet in a way that was companionable rather than uncomfortable, and Clara, who had spent a long time surrounded by people who filled silence nervously, found it restful. They talked when there was something to say and did not manufacture conversation when there was not, and that ease built between them with the quiet solidity of something being constructed properly. On the first hour's ride, he asked about her time as a schoolteacher and listened without the half-attention that men sometimes gave to women's recountings of their professional lives. She told him about the school in Abilene, the way the children came in coated with the season's prairie dust in fall, mud in spring, snow in their collars in winter, and how she had always loved the moment when a child's face changed from blank incomprehension to sudden understanding, that flash of the thing clicking into place. "What made you stop?" he asked. "Marriage," she said simply. "Thomas needed someone to keep his accounts, and I was willing. I was not sorry." She paused. "I miss the children sometimes." "You're good with people," he said. "You handled Bick better than most officers twice your age." "I have had a great deal of practice managing willful authority," she said, and he laughed, a real laugh, brief and warm, and it suited him. She asked about him in return, because she was genuinely curious and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. He had grown up in Pennsylvania, the son of a surveyor who had come west with the railroad in the early days and stayed. He had studied law for a year and a half before the war. The war between the states had touched him at the edge. He had been too young for the main years of it, and had come into the Army through the legal officer pathway. He had been at 3 different postings before Fort Reader. He was, she gathered, a man who was good at his job and largely content with it, but who carried in the quieter parts of his expression something that had not yet found its full resolution. "Have you always been alone?" she asked, and then immediately added, "That was too direct. Forgive me." "No," he said, and there was an evenness in his voice that indicated the question did not wound him but had been considered. "There was a woman in Fort Leavenworth. It did not suit either of us in the end." "I'm sorry," Clara said. "Don't be," he said, with a sincerity that was not bitterness. "She was a fine person. We wanted different things from the same life. It's better to know early." Clara nodded. The land around them was changing as they rode southwest, the flat plains giving way to a gentler rolling country with draws and creek beds and stands of cedar. The air smelled of dry grass and somewhere ahead, water. "The Crestwood Valley is through those hills," Aaron said, pointing at a low blue line of ridges on the horizon. "We'll be there by early afternoon." They stopped at midday by a creek to water the horses and eat from the provisions. Aaron had packed hard bread, dried meat, 2 apples that were a little past their best but still good. Clara sat on a flat rock by the water and Aaron sat on the bank with his legs stretched out, and they ate without ceremony, and it was one of those moments that would stay in memory, not because anything significant happened in it, but because of the quality of the light and the ease between two people who were becoming something to each other. "Do you know what you'll do with the land?" he asked. "Once it's properly yours." "I think I'll farm it," she said. "Not on my own. I'd need to hire help for the first season at least." Thomas had ideas about wheat in the lower portions and cattle on the high ground. She looked at the hills ahead. He was right about the land, even if he was wrong about a number of other things. "Wrong how?" Aaron asked. "He was not good at asking for help," she said. "He thought self-sufficiency was a virtue at the expense of everything else. He would rather lose something than admit he needed assistance." She paused. "I do not intend to make the same mistake." Aaron looked at her with that careful dark attention she was coming to recognize as his native mode of seeing. "You drove 300 miles and fought a colonel for this land," he said. "That's not lacking in self-sufficiency." "That is not self-sufficiency," she said. "That is stubbornness. There is a difference. Self-sufficiency refuses help. Stubbornness refuses to stop. I asked for your help the moment I understood it was available." "You did," he said, and there was a warmth in those 2 words that was so simple and so genuine that it went straight past her defenses without announcement. They reached the Crestwood Valley in the early afternoon, and it was more beautiful than Thomas's descriptions had managed to convey. The valley was wide and green, cut through with a clear running creek that caught the September sunlight, bordered by cedar-covered hills on 3 sides and open to the south. The land had a quality of quietness that was not emptiness but fullness, the way a room feels when it has been well used and now rests. Clara sat on her horse at the top of the rise that looked down into the valley and felt something open in her that had been closed for a long time. "This is it," she said. "The south boundary marker should be that rock formation," Aaron said, pointing. "The deed description matches. I checked it against the survey maps in the files." She looked at him. "You checked it against the survey maps?" "Last night," he said, "before I drafted the petition. I wanted to be certain there were no conflicting claims in the survey records." She was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "Captain Garrett," she said. "Aaron," he said, "please." "Aaron," she said, and his name felt natural in her mouth, which she noted the way you note something that surprises you by feeling inevitable. "Why did you do all of this?" He looked at the valley rather than at her. "Because the law was on your side," he said, which was what he had said before, but this time it did not feel like the whole answer, and they both knew it. "And," she said. He turned to look at her then, fully, the way he sometimes looked at a document he was reading with complete attention. "Because you were right," he said, "and someone should have told you so 300 miles ago, and the fact that they didn't says something about them, not about the deed. And because," he stopped. "Because," she said quietly, "because you are one of the most remarkable people I have met in a long time," he said simply, with a plainness that was more affecting than anything ornate would have been. "And I find that I am not in any hurry for this to be over." Clara looked at him for a long moment in the September light. The valley spread below them, the sky enormous and blue overhead. She thought about Thomas and about the years of careful, affectionate, insufficient love, and she thought about what it felt like to sit across from a person who listened the way Aaron listened and thought the way Aaron thought, and she made a decision with the same clean directness she had applied to everything else on this journey. "Neither am I," she said. They rode down into the valley. The next hours were something Clara would return to many times in the years that followed, riding the boundary of the land together. Aaron reading the deed survey descriptions aloud while she matched them to what she could see. The creek running alongside the southern portion. The cedar stands on the western hill marking the natural corner. The wide, flat center of the valley that would be. She could already see it, magnificent wheat country. They talked about it as they rode, practically and specifically, what it would need, what kind of help, what the first season would look like. Aaron knew the territory and knew something about land management from his years of posting work, and Clara had Thomas's notes and her own intelligence and the bone-deep certainty that this was right, that this was the thing she was supposed to be doing. The trouble came in the late afternoon, as Aaron had warned it might. 3 riders came up from the south end of the valley, and Clara could tell before they reached speaking distance that they were not pleased. The man in front was heavyset and red-faced under a wide hat, riding a pale horse with the assurance of a man accustomed to going where he chose. He pulled up 20 yards away and looked at Clara and Aaron with the flat territorial hostility of someone who had been using this space as his own for long enough to consider it his. "Fort's man," he said, looking at Aaron's uniform. "What's the Army's business in Crestwood Valley?" "No Army business today," Aaron said calmly. "I'm here in a personal capacity accompanying Mrs. Vaughn. This is her land." The man looked at Clara. "Her land," he said, with a flatness that was not quite a question. "We've been running cattle through this valley for 2 years. Nobody's claimed it." "It has been claimed," Clara said, and her voice was steady and clear in the quiet afternoon air. "Filed in 1867 and recognized this week by Fort Reader under the hardship provision of the 1871 Territorial Amendment. I have the signed documentation." She reached for her satchel. "I don't need to see your papers," the man said, and there was a shift in his posture, something hardening. "But you do," Aaron said, and his voice had changed slightly, not raised, but with a weight in it that carried further. "Because Mrs. Vaughn's deed is legally recognized, which means your cattle have been grazing on private land for 2 years. The law is generous on this point. It does not require back payment for unauthorized grazing when the claimant was absent. But it does require immediate acknowledgement of the boundary and compliance going forward. Those are your options, and I am prepared to explain them in detail if you would like." The heavyset man looked at the 2 riders beside him. Something passed between them, a reading of the situation. Aaron sat his horse without moving, watching them with the same clear attention he brought to everything, not aggressive, not uncertain, simply present and absolutely unbluffable. The man on the pale horse looked at Clara again. She met his eyes without looking away, holding the satchel in her lap. "You intend to work this land?" He asked her, and she heard the shift in it, not yet concession but getting there. "I do," she said, "and I intend to be a fair neighbor to anyone who is a fair neighbor to me. I don't bear ill will for the past use. I only ask that it stop." Another long moment. The man made a sound that was somewhere between a grunt and a sigh and turned his horse. "We'll move the cattle," he said, "south of the creek." "Thank you," Clara said, and meant it. They rode off, and Aaron waited until they were out of earshot before he exhaled slowly. "Well handled," he said. "You too," she said. "That line about not requiring back payment was inspired." "It's also true," he said. "But yes, I delivered it at a useful moment." She laughed, and it felt like the first fully real laugh she had released in a very long time, the kind that comes from the chest rather than just the face. He turned to look at her when she laughed, and his expression was open in a way she had not quite seen on him before, unguarded and warm. And she thought that this man, this careful, thorough, quietly remarkable man, was doing something to her heart that she had no intention of stopping. They made camp that night in the valley, at the edge of the creek where the cedar smell was strong, and the stars came out in the huge, unhurried profusion of stars that only appeared away from any settlement. Aaron built a fire with the efficiency of someone who had done it many times in many places, and they sat beside it after eating, close enough to feel the heat, the darkness settling around them like something gentle. "Tell me something true," Clara said, which was a thing she had sometimes said to Thomas in their early years, a kind of game that he had been charmed by but never quite comfortable with. She said it now without thinking, from habit, and then felt a slight self-consciousness about it. But Aaron did not look uncertain. He looked at the fire for a moment and then said, "I have been at 4 different postings in 8 years, and I have always told myself that I was comfortable with moving, that it suited my temperament. But I think I have told myself that because the alternative was admitting that I had not yet found a reason to want to stay somewhere." Clara looked at him in the firelight. "And now," she said. He met her eyes. "Now I am considering that I may have been wrong about my own temperament," he said. The fire crackled. The creek ran softly. The stars were enormous overhead. Clara said, "Tell me something else true." "You are the most direct person I have ever met," he said, "and I find it remarkable. Remarkable in the way that good things are when you are not expecting them." "That is almost a compliment," she said. "It is entirely a compliment," he said. "I am just not as direct as you, so it takes me longer to arrive at the full sentence." She smiled at that, and he smiled at her smile, and neither of them said anything for a little while, which was its own kind of conversation. "Aaron," she said finally. "Clara," he said, and the way he said her name was different from the way he said everything else. There was a care in it, a slight weight, like he was handling something he did not want to drop. "I am going to ask you something direct," she said. "Of course you are," he said, and the affection in it was plain. "When we go back to the fort," she said, "I don't want this to be a thing that gets put away neatly in a file and closed. I don't want to thank you properly and ride back to Kansas and have this be finished. I don't want that." The fire popped. His face in the firelight was very still and very warm. "I don't want that either," he said. "I told you I am not in a hurry for this to be over." "I know," she said, "but I want it to be clear. I am not a woman who is good at waiting for things to happen at other people's pace. If something is worth wanting, I think it should be said." He turned toward her fully, giving her all of his attention in the way he did when something mattered to him. "You are worth wanting," he said, plainly and directly, and she heard the effort it cost him, not from fear but from the weight of sincerity, the way important things always cost something when you say them truly. "And I would like very much to know you more than this, Clara. I would like that a great deal." She reached over and put her hand on his, just that, just her hand on his on the warm side of the firelight, and he turned his hand and held hers, and they sat that way as the night settled in around them, quiet and vast and full, in the way that the wild country was when you were not afraid of it. They rode back to Fort Reader the next morning, and the world had rearranged itself slightly. Nothing dramatic, no sudden transformation, but a shift in the light between them, a new ease that had found its shape. They talked the whole way back, which Clara noted because she was a person who kept track of these things, of how much there was to say, how naturally it came, how often he made her laugh and she made him think. The following days were full of practical business. Aaron drafted the final recognition documents and had them formally recorded in the fort's land registry, which was the legally binding step that put Clara's ownership beyond any future challenge. He walked her through every aspect of the process with the thoroughness that she was coming to think of as simply him, not pedantic, not patronizing, but complete. He wanted her to understand every step, not because she needed to be educated, but because he respected her enough to think she would want to know. Clara, meanwhile, began making plans. She spent a morning with Del Pickett, who turned out to know every rancher, farmer, and tradesman within 100 miles of the fort, and who gave her the names of 2 experienced farmhands who were looking for steady work, a man in Crestwood Township who ran a reliable supply operation, and a woman named Judith Holt, who had been running her own ranch since her husband died of fever 4 years ago, and who might be willing to advise on the cattle portion of the operation. Me, the laundress, told Clara over coffee one afternoon that Captain Garrett had not been seen sitting outside reading in the evening since Clara arrived, which was apparently a noted change in his habits. "He sits with you in the mess after supper instead," Me said, with the satisfaction of a woman who had noticed everything. "We talk," Clara said. "I imagine you do," Me said, very pleasantly. They did talk, every evening after supper in the mess, at a table in the corner where the light was good, and where Aaron would sometimes bring whatever document or text he was currently working through, not to ignore her but to show her, to share it in the way of people who like to think together. They argued about property law and about novel writing, and about the best way to manage creek bottom land in a dry year. They discovered a shared and apparently passionate disagreement about Dickens, which consumed most of one evening and which Clara won, Aaron conceded, on the strength of her specific textual knowledge. They talked about his family in Pennsylvania and her family in Ohio, where she had grown up before coming to Kansas. They talked about what they wanted from the next 10 years, which was a conversation that neither of them took lightly and which said, in the plainness of its assumptions, a great deal about where they both thought this was going. 3 weeks after Clara had arrived at Fort Reader, on an evening with a wind from the north carrying the first real bite of the coming winter, Aaron walked her to the door of the boarding quarters and stood on the step and said, "I have been thinking about what comes next." "So have I," she said. "I'd like to request a transfer," he said, "to the Territorial Land Office in Crestwood Township. It's a civilian appointment. I would leave the Army. I have been considering it for some time, independent of before," he stopped, started again. "I want to be clear that this is not a decision I am making on impulse. I have been looking at the possibility for 6 months." "But you have made it feel immediate." Clara looked at him in the lamplight from the boarding room window. "Are you telling me or asking me?" "Both," he said. "I'm telling you my intentions and I'm asking whether that is something that—" "Aaron," she said. "Yes." "Come inside and have some coffee and tell me what you actually want to say," she said. He did. He came inside and sat across from her at the small table, and she made coffee on the small stove and set it in front of him and sat across from him, and he looked at her directly and said, "I want to stay where you are. I want to help you build something on that land. I want to find out what we are to each other properly and with time, and I believe we should be in the same place for that." He paused. "I am not asking you to marry me tonight. I would not rush you like that. I would not object to being asked," Clara said. The silence that followed that was perhaps 3 seconds, but it had the density of much longer. Aaron set down his coffee cup. His expression did something complicated and then resolved into something very clear. "Clara," he said, and it was the way he always said her name, with that particular weight and care. "Would you marry me?" "Yes," she said, without equivocation or performance, directly and immediately, because it was true and she had never seen the point in pretending a true thing needed time. He reached across the table and took her hand, and then he was out of his chair and she was out of hers, and she was standing in the lamplight of that small room with his arms around her for the first time, and it felt like arriving somewhere after a very long road, solid and warm and completely right. He pulled back slightly to look at her face, and she looked at his, and there was that shift in the air again, the one that had first appeared in his office when she realized he had actually read the deed, and this time there was nothing preliminary about it. He kissed her, gently and then less gently, and she kissed him back, and outside the wind moved through the fort and the stars were somewhere above the clouds, and the land was turning slowly toward winter. The next month was one of the most alive periods of Clara's life. Aaron put in the transfer request and began the paperwork for his civilian appointment. Clara made 2 more trips out to the Crestwood Valley with Del Pickett, and the farmhands Del had recommended a solid, quiet man named Elias Brooke and his younger brother Samuel, to assess what the land would need for a spring planting. The main house site was clear, a natural rise above the creek's flood line with southern exposure, and a good stand of cedar upslope for windbreak timber. They would need to build, and build quickly before winter truly set in, to have anything ready for spring. Aaron took leave on a Thursday and Friday, and they rode out to the valley together with Elias and Samuel, and he and Clara walked the house site together while the brothers measured and assessed the timber stand. They talked about what the house should be. Not elaborate, neither of them wanted elaborate but solid, with good windows, a proper kitchen because Clara cooked seriously, a room that could serve as an office for Aaron's land work, and enough space that it could grow as the family grew. "We could add a room later," she said, which was how she said it, practically and with the future in it, and Aaron looked at her with a warmth that had nothing practiced in it. "We could add several," he said. Judith Holt came out to meet them that weekend, riding over from her own spread 8 miles to the east, a compact, sun-browned woman of about 40 who had the most direct handshake Clara had encountered outside of Aaron himself, and who assessed the valley's cattle potential with the efficient eye of experience. She approved of Clara's plans, offered useful corrections to 2 of them, and told Aaron to his face that he seemed like a sensible man, which was, Dell later told him, high praise from Judith. They were married in November at the fort's small chapel, before Aaron's official separation from the army was complete. Colonel Bick was not in attendance, which was fine with everyone concerned. Monroe came, with a decent grace that Clara chose to attribute to genuine good feeling, because she preferred to think well of people when she had the option. Dell Pickett was there, in what appeared to be a very old but carefully maintained good coat. Me was there, and cried thoroughly and without embarrassment. Elias and Samuel Brooke rode up from the valley, where they had spent the previous 3 weeks beginning the foundation work on the house. The ceremony was short and the words were simple, and when the chaplain said, "You may kiss your bride," Aaron kissed her with a particular thoroughness that made me cry harder and Dell cough in a way that was probably not entirely a cough. Afterward there was a small celebration in the mess that lasted longer than any of them had planned, because someone produced a fiddle, and someone else produced a harmonica, and Dell turned out to be a surprisingly good dancer for a man missing 2 fingers on his left hand. Clara danced with Aaron in the warm lamplight of the mess while the fiddle played, his hand warm at her waist, her hand in his, and she thought about the widow who had arrived at this fort 2 months ago with a deed nobody would honor, and a stubbornness that refused to stop, and she felt not triumphant exactly, but satisfied in the deep, settled way of something completed right. They spent their wedding night in the boarding room that had become familiar to her, and in the morning they rode together to the valley, which was theirs now in every sense. The winter was real, as plains winters always were, but they were not unprepared for it. The house went up through November and into December with the Brooke brothers' skilled hands and Aaron's precise organization, and Clara's ability to make every decision that needed making without delay. It was not a large house, but it was well built, the logs tight, and the windows fitted properly, and the stone fireplace in the main room so well laid that Elias, who had been skeptical about Aaron's involvement in the masonry design, admitted it drew better than any he had built himself. They moved in before the first real snow, which arrived in mid-December and covered the valley in white silence. They lay that night in their own bed in their own house listening to the wind and the fire and nothing else, and Aaron said, in the dark, "I have been at 4 different places in 8 years, and I have never once felt like I was where I was supposed to be. And now," she said, which was the same question she had asked him by the campfire in September, "now I know exactly where I am," he said. She put her hand on his chest over his heart and felt it beat. "So do I," she said. The winter passed with its own rhythms. Aaron set up his land office work in the room they had designated for it, beginning to build the civilian practice that would, over the next years, become well established in the territory. A legal officer who knew both the military and civilian sides of the land law, who read every document fully before making a judgment, and who was known from Fort Reader to Crestwood Township as a man you could trust to give you a straight answer. Clara ran the farm's business end with the methodical intelligence she had applied to everything else, and spent a portion of most days teaching Elia's wife, a young woman named Rose who had come to join her husband in January, how to read and manage her own accounts. It was not a school, but it had the quality of one, and Clara found that it fed something in her that had been quietly hungry. Spring came with the particular joy that spring always carried in that country, the grass coming back green along the creek, and the sky opening to a blue that was deeper and more saturated than the pale winter sky. They planted in April wheat in the flat lower valley, exactly as Thomas had envisioned, and a kitchen garden on the south side of the house. Elias and Samuel handled the planting with the confidence of experienced hands, and Clara and Aaron worked alongside them in the mornings, coming in mud-handed for the midday meal that me, who had left the fort's laundress work and come to cook for them through the growing season, produced with an abundance that bordered on the theatrical. There were difficulties that spring and summer, because difficulty was simply part of the life. The heavy-set rancher from their first encounter in the valley, his name turned out to be Kurt Meadows, tested the southern boundary twice, moving his cattle across the creek line. The first time, Clara rode out and spoke to him herself. The second time, Aaron rode with her and brought the formal documentation, and Kurt Meadows looked at it and at Aaron and at Clara, who sat her horse with the same still, direct attention she had sat across from Colonel Bick with, and he moved his cattle and he did not move them again. By summer's end, he had actually sent word through an intermediary that he would be interested in negotiating a legal grazing agreement for the unused upper pasture, which Aaron drew up properly, and which turned out to benefit both parties, and which became the foundation of a working relationship that was not warm but was reliable. In June, Clara realized she was pregnant. She told Aaron on a warm evening when the wheat was coming up strong and the creek was running clear, and the light was golden and long over the valley. He was sitting on the front step of the house with a document he was reviewing, and she came and sat beside him and said his name, and something in her voice made him put the document down immediately. "I'm going to have a child," she said. "Our child." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that she could only describe as luminous, which was a word she had always considered slightly fanciful and which turned out to be exactly the right one. He put his arms around her and held her close, and she felt him breathe, one deep, deliberate breath, like a man setting something down that he had been carrying for a long time. "I am so glad," he said simply into her hair. "So am I," she said. The pregnancy was healthy, and Clara was practical about it in the way she was practical about everything, which did not mean she was unaffected, but that being affected and being functional were not, in her experience, incompatible states. She continued running the accounts and the teaching sessions with Rose and the farm's daily management. Aaron watched over her with a care that was attentive without being smothering, which was the exact balance she would have asked for if asked, and which he seemed to understand without being asked. Judith Holt came by regularly through the summer, partly on neighborly business and partly, Clara suspected, because she had decided she liked them and was not someone who wasted time pretending she did not like people she liked. She told Clara, on one of these visits, that she was the most competent person she had met in the valley in 4 years, which coming from Judith was the equivalent of a lengthy oration from anyone else. In October, on a cool, bright morning with the wheat long harvested and the valley settling into its autumn gold, Clara gave birth to a son. The birth was managed by Judith, who had delivered more calves than she could count and approached human birth with the same brisk competence, and by Rose, who had experience and good hands, and by Aaron, who was present and useful and who managed to stay completely functional until the moment the baby was safely born and breathing and bundled. at which point he sat down on the floor against the wall with the specific dazed expression of a man who has been holding himself together by force of will and has just allowed the will to relax. Clara, from the bed, exhausted and certain and entirely herself, looked at him on the floor. "Aaron." He looked up. His eyes were bright. "Come see your son," she said. He got up and came to the bed and looked at the small, wrinkled, absolutely furious-looking person in Clara's arms, and his face did the thing it sometimes did, the thing she loved most about him, where it became completely unguarded, every layer down, just him looking at something that mattered more than he had words for. "He looks angry," Aaron said. "He will have opinions," Clara said. "He comes by it honestly." Aaron sat on the edge of the bed and put his arm around her, and she leaned her head against him, the baby between them. And outside the valley was full of autumn light, and the creek ran, and the cedar on the high hills was dark and still, and everything was, in this moment, exactly as it should be. They named the boy James Thomas Garrett. Thomas for the man who had loved this land first, and whose vision and whose deed had set everything in motion. And James because it was Aaron's father's name, and because it sounded solid, like something built to last. James Thomas Garrett turned out to be a child of strong opinions and enormous energy, which was, as Clara had predicted, honest inheritance from both sides. He walked at 9 months and was attempting to run at 10, with the result that his first year was a continuous series of minor disasters that he regarded as interesting experiments. Aaron watched his son with an expression of delighted bewilderment that Clara found completely charming, and she watched Aaron watching his son, and felt something in her chest that she had no simpler name for than love, the kind that accumulates and deepens, and does not diminish with familiarity, but grows more specific and more complete, as you learn the shapes of a person's courage and humor and goodness over time. Del Pickett visited in the spring of 1875, on his way from the fort toward a new posting with a survey team in the Northern Territory. He sat on their front step in the evening light with a cup of coffee and little James on his knee, and he looked out at the valley and said, with the succinctness of a man who did not waste words, "This turned out well." "It did," Aaron said. "Told you Garrett read things carefully," Del said to Clara. "You did," she said. "It was the best advice I received." Del looked pleased in the contained way of a man who did not show pleasure extravagantly. He stayed 2 days and played with James and talked to Aaron about the survey work, and told Clara that she had the best-run operation in the lower valley, which was the plain truth, and they both knew it. After Del left, Aaron and Clara sat on the step in the evening as they often did, James asleep inside, the valley quiet around them. The wheat was coming up again in the lower fields, and the creek was running high with spring water, and the sky was the particular deep blue of a plain spring evening, that color that did not exist anywhere else. "I have something to tell you," Clara said. Aaron looked at her. He knew her well enough by now, the tone of her voice and the set of her shoulders, to know before she said it. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the valley, and then he turned to her with that luminous, unguarded expression that she had come to think of as the most purely Aaron thing about him, the expression that lived beneath all the careful professional competence and the precise legal mind and the quiet reserve, this absolute openness to joy when it came. "Good," he said, and took her hand. The second child was a girl, born in November of 1875, with dark eyes like her father and the look of someone who had already made several decisions by the time she arrived. They named her Eleanor Ruth Garrett. Eleanor because Clara had always liked it, Ruth because it meant something about staying, about saying where you are is where I will be, and she thought that was a fine thing to name a daughter born in a valley that people had tried to take away, and that had been kept by love and stubbornness, and one officer who read a document carefully. Life in the Crestwood Valley in those years was not without its difficulties. No life was, and the territory was still rough and working out its own shape, with all the injustices that came with that. Clara was aware, as any person with open eyes was aware, that the land she farmed had once been land that other people had moved across freely, and that the military presence that had ultimately helped her had also been the instrument of a great deal of harm in the territory that should not be forgotten or smoothed over. She said this plainly to Aaron, and he agreed without equivocation, because he had seen it from the inside of the uniform, and he did not pretend it away. They talked about it honestly, which was not enough to fix the larger injustice, but was at least the minimum that honesty required. They were careful neighbors in the ways available to them. Aaron, in his civilian land work, applied the same thoroughness to everyone who came to him, regardless of their standing, and more than once he found provisions in the territorial law that protected parties who had been told nothing protected them, because he read every statute all the way to the end. By 1876, the farm was established in the full sense profitable, managed properly, with Elias and Samuel Brooke as permanent partners in the operation, and Rose Brooke as Clara's closest friend in the valley. The house had its added room, just as Aaron had predicted, and the kitchen was exactly what Clara had wanted, and the office was exactly what Aaron needed. James was 2 years old and deeply passionate about horses, which Aaron encouraged with a dedication that Clara suspected was at least partly an excuse for Aaron himself to spend more time near the horses, and Alina was learning to walk with the same decisive energy she had applied to everything since birth. On an evening in late summer of 1876, Clara stood at the kitchen window washing the day's dishes and looking out at the valley in the last of the light. The wheat had been harvested, and the fields were gold stubble, and the creek ran low the way it always did in August, and the cedar hills were dark against the sky. Aaron came up behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back against him, fitting herself into the warmth of him the way she had 1,000 times, and they stood there watching the light change. "Do you remember what I said to you," he said, "when you came to my office that first day? You said the law was on my side," she said, "and then you read the deed." "And then I read the deed," he said, "all of it, very carefully, and found something no one else had bothered to look for," she said. "I found what was already there," he said. "That is all I did." She turned in his arms to face him, tipping her head back to look at him in the evening light. He was 33 now, and the slight lines at the corners of his eyes had deepened, and his hair was still a little long, and he looked like a man who had found the place he was meant to be, and had settled into it with the quiet certainty of something built on solid ground. "You did more than that," she said. "We did more than that," he said. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, the way she had done hundreds of times and would do hundreds more, and he turned his face slightly to press his lips to her palm, the way he always did, and James could be heard in the next room engaging in some kind of vigorous solo negotiation with his wooden horse, and Alina was presumably asleep, and the valley was enormous and quiet outside, and Clara thought about the deed in her satchel that she had carried 300 miles, and the fort where nobody would look at it properly, and the officer who had finally read it carefully and changed his answer, and how that reading had changed everything. "Come sit with me," she said. They went to the front step, where the air was warm and the stars were just beginning to come out, one by one, the way they always did out here, unhurried, filling the sky from east to west. James, having finished his negotiation, padded to the door and came out and climbed into Clara's lap without asking, because he was two, and it had never occurred to him that this required asking. She wrapped her arms around him, and he settled with the boneless total comfort of a small child, who knows absolutely that he is safe. Aaron put his arm around Clara's shoulders, and she leaned into his side, and James was warm against her, and Alina was sleeping inside, and the night was coming in gently over the valley and the wheat fields and the creek and the cedar hills. "Tell me something true," she said, as she had said by a campfire in September 2 years and an entire life ago. Aaron was quiet for a moment, which meant he was finding the most accurate sentence. He always did. She loved that about him, the care he took with truth. "I have read a great many documents in my life," he said, "and the best thing I ever found in any of them was you." She turned her face up and he kissed her, there on the step in the settling dark, while their son dozed against her and their daughter slept inside and their land stretched away to the horizon in every direction. Theirs, fully and finally and irrevocably theirs. The stars continued to appear overhead, the great wild spread of them that covered the plain sky from edge to edge, and the night was full of the sounds of the valley, the creek, the wind in the cedar, the horses shifting in the pen, and the two people on the step stayed where they were for a long time after the stars were all out, in no hurry to move, belonging entirely to the place and the moment and each other. It was, in every sense that mattered, exactly enough. In the years that followed, the valley filled with the particular richness of a life fully lived. James grew into a boy who could identify every bird in the territory by call, and who followed Aaron around the land with an attention that was equal parts adoration and critical assessment, already forming his own opinions on soil quality and water rights at an age when most children were interested primarily in mud. Eleanor, when she was old enough to walk the boundaries with her parents, did so with a proprietary air that made Judith Holt remark that the girl had her mother's bones and her father's eyes, and some quality of her own that was purely itself. Aaron expanded his land practice to cover 3 additional townships by 1878, building a reputation not only for thoroughness, but for the particular quality of his attention to clients who had been told there was nothing to be done. More than once, and in more than one variety of circumstance, he found the provision, the clause, the statutory language that had been overlooked or willfully ignored, and applied it in the way it had been intended to apply. He was known for reading everything fully, which was not as common a professional virtue as it ought to have been, and which mattered enormously to the people for whom the difference between a quick read and a careful one meant the difference between keeping their land and losing it. Clara had her school, properly constituted, by 1879, not a large one, but a real one, built in a room of the house that had been extended twice by then, and which she ran with the full and practical rigor of a woman who had been thinking about this for a decade. Rose Brooks' children were her first students, and then the children of 3 neighboring families, and then by word of mouth the children of families further out, some riding considerable distances, because the school had the quality that good schools always had of being a place where children felt they were being taken seriously. One evening in 1880, sitting at the kitchen table after supper while the children were in bed, and the lamp was burning low, Aaron looked up from the case file he was reviewing and said, "I received a letter today from the Territorial Land Authority in Dodge City." Clara, who was mending a shirt, looked up. "Good news or bad?" "They want me to advise on a systematic review of all denied land claims in the territory from 1870 to 1875, he said. "The same period that affected your deed. Apparently there were a significant number of cases handled the way yours was, the hardship clause applied incorrectly or not at all." Clara put down the shirt. "How many cases?" "They don't yet know," he said. "That is part of what the review would establish." She looked at him for a long moment. "You should do it," she said. "It would take me away from home a great deal for several months," he said. "I want to know what you think." "I think," she said, "that what happened to me happened to other people and that if you can help them, you should." She picked the shirt back up. "And I am quite capable of managing here." "I know you are," he said, with the slightly unnecessary emphasis of a man who had never doubted it. "I just wanted to ask." She smiled at him across the lamplight. "Go," she said. "Read carefully, find the clause." He did. The review took 4 months, and Aaron spent much of it in Dodge City and at various fort-adjacent land offices, working through case files with the comprehensive attention that was his professional trademark. He came home when he could and wrote long letters when he could not, letters that were both full of the case details and full of the more personal things. What he missed, what he was thinking, the specific texture of being away from the valley and the house and her and the children. Clara wrote back in kind, and her letters, she knew from how he read them when they arrived, were among the things he valued most about the months away. She told him about the children and the farm and the school, and she told him, plainly and without embellishment, that she missed him specifically and completely, and would be glad when he was home. The review ultimately identified 63 cases in the territory where the hardship clause had been incorrectly denied. 41 of them were remediated, the land recognized, and the claimants notified. The other 22 involved complications that required further proceedings. It was not a perfect outcome, but it was a real one, and Aaron came home from it with the particular satisfaction of a man who has done useful work and the particular hunger of a man who has been away from everything he loves for 4 months. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in spring, riding up the valley trail with his coat dusty and his saddlebags heavy with paper and his face thinner from the months of town work and travel. Clara was in the yard with Alina when she saw him coming, and she felt the same thing she had felt the first time she watched him come out of the officer's mess, that particular attention, that quickened state of being, which 8 years had not diminished, but only deepened and made more specific and more sure. She walked out to meet him, and he swung down from his horse, and she went into his arms and held on, and he held her with the solidity of a man returning to the center of his own life. "How did it go?" she said into his shoulder. 41 out of 63, he said. "More work to do." "There always is," she said. "Are you home now?" "I am home," he said, and tightened his arms around her. James came running from the barn at full speed, having been watching from the hayloft window, and threw himself at his father with the confidence of a child who had never once doubted the reception he would receive. Alina came at a more measured pace, because she had a dignity even at 4 that she was not going to abandon for running, and Aaron crouched down and scooped her up, and she put her arms around his neck with the complete proprietary affection of a daughter who has decided her father is entirely hers. "I brought you something," he told her. "What?" she said. He produced from his coat pocket a small carved wooden bird that he had bought from a craftsman in Dodge City, a red-tailed hawk with its wings spread. Alina looked at it with the serious assessment of a child who has opinions. "It's a hawk," she said. "It is," Aaron said. She considered for one more moment. "It is good," she pronounced, and closed her small hand around it with an air of finality. Aaron met Clara's eyes over Alina's head, and she met his. And there was in that exchange all the things that long and honest love accumulates. The humor, and the tenderness, and the remembering and the still-present warmth of the thing that had started with a deed and a careful reading, and 2 people who were willing to be direct about what they wanted. That evening, with the children in bed and the valley dark and the lamp burning, they sat at the kitchen table, and Aaron told her about the cases in detail, the ones he had been able to help, and the ones that had proven harder, and she listened with the full attention she gave everything that mattered to her. Outside, the spring stars were coming out over the valley, and the wheat was already up green in the lower fields, and the creek ran clear, and the house that they had built together was warm and solid around them. 63 people, Clara said. "At minimum," Aaron said. "There may be more in the records we didn't reach yet." She nodded. Then she said, "When you read my deed the first time in your office, what did you think?" He looked at her with that slight inward focus he had when he was being precise. "I thought it was a good deed," he said. "Well drawn, properly witnessed, and that the person who filed it had known what they were doing." He paused. "And I thought the woman sitting across the desk from me had known exactly what she had and exactly what she was owed and had come 300 miles to make sure someone acknowledged it." "And what did you feel?" she asked. He looked at the lamp for a moment and then at her directly, the way he always looked at things he was taking seriously. I felt awake," he said, "in the way you feel when something matters. I had not felt precisely that way in some time." She reached across the table and took his hand. He held hers with the familiar warmth of a man who had been holding this hand for years and still found it the right hand to hold. "You changed my answer," he said. She raised her eyebrows. "You changed your own answer," she said. "You read the document. I only gave you the document." "You gave me considerably more than the document," he said. She smiled. "You're getting better at the direct sentence," she said. "I've had a good teacher," he said. The lamp burned. The valley was dark and still outside. Somewhere in the house James murmured in his sleep about horses, probably, and Alina held her carved hawk in the dark, and the deed that had traveled 300 miles and been read by one careful man was filed properly now in the Crestwood Land Registry, stamped and countersigned and beyond any future challenge. Clara Garrett looked at her husband across the kitchen table, at this man who had read a document all the way to the end, and found what was already there and changed his answer and stayed. And she thought that some things, the best things, were simply a matter of someone finally paying the attention that the truth required. She lifted her coffee cup. "To careful reading," she said. He lifted his and touched it to hers. "To stubborn women," he said. "To both," she said. And they drank. And the night settled around the valley like something placed there with intention. And the story that had begun with a deed and a long road and a fort where nobody would look past the first line closed into itself like a book that ends exactly where it ought to, with everything resolved, and everyone where they belong, and the kind of love between two people that has been tested enough to know it is real and found solid every time. Outside, the stars burned over the wild country, the same stars that had been there for the campfire in September, and the step in the evening, and every ordinary, extraordinary moment between then and now, countless and clear and going on.